Imagine you could drain every drop of water out of the Pacific Ocean and walk across the exposed seafloor toward the single lowest point on the surface of the planet. You would end up standing at the bottom of a wound in the Earth's crust so deep that it swallows sunlight, muffles sound, and breaks almost every rule we think we know about where life can survive. This place has a name. It is called the Challenger Deep, and it is the deepest part of the ocean anywhere on Earth. So how deep is the Mariana Trench really? The honest answer is that the numbers are almost impossible to feel. The trench itself is a long, narrow scar in the floor of the Western Pacific, curving for more than 2,500 kilometers out near the island of Guam. And at its lowest known point, the seafloor lies nearly 11 kilometers straight down. The most careful modern surveys put the Mariana Trench depth at somewhere around 10,900 meters, roughly 36,000 feet. That is deeper than airliners cruise overhead. If you sank at a slow walking pace, it would take you the better part of an hour just to reach the bottom. And here is a detail most people never hear. The exact figure is still argued over. Different expeditions, using different sonar and different pressure gauges, have come back with slightly different answers, and the true Challenger deep depth has crept up and down by tens of meters over the decades. When you are trying to measure 11 kilometers of crushing black water from a ship on the surface, even our best instruments disagree. So the deepest point on Earth is not just remote, it is genuinely, stubbornly hard to pin down. Here is the comparison that finally makes the scale land. Take Mount Everest, the tallest mountain on the planet, nearly 9 kilometers from base to summit, and drop the entire mountain into the Challenger Deep. It would vanish. The peak, the literal roof of our world, the place climbers die trying to touch, would still sit more than 2 kilometers beneath the waves, with over a mile of freezing black water stacked on top of it. The highest place we know, and the deepest point on Earth, and the deep winds with room to spare. So why is it here, of all places? The trench is not a random dent. It sits along a line where two vast pieces of the Earth's outer shell collide. Here, the enormous Pacific tectonic plate is slowly sliding underneath its neighbor, bending downward and diving back into the hot interior of the planet. That endless grinding descent is what carves the trench and keeps it deep, and it is the same violent process that feeds the volcanoes and earthquakes ringing the entire Pacific. The deepest place in the ocean is really a seam in the planet, a spot where the surface of the Earth is quietly folding back into itself. Now let us actually make the descent and pay attention to what disappears on the way down. Just how deep is the ocean before the light gives out? Not very. In the top layer, the sunlit zone, the water is bright and warm and full of familiar life, but sunlight fades fast. By around 200 meters, you enter a blue twilight where photosynthesis stops. Push past roughly 1,000 meters and the last glimmer of surface light is simply gone. From there, all the way to the bottom, more than 9 further kilometers, it is permanently, absolutely black. No day, no night, no season, just cold, still darkness that has never once been touched by the sun. With the light goes the warmth. Down in the trench, the water hovers only a degree or two above freezing, held liquid by its salt and by the very pressure that would kill you. And that pressure is the real monster of the deep. At the surface, the air presses on your body at 1 atmosphere and you never notice it. At the bottom of the Challenger Deep, the weight of all that water above pushes down at over 1,000 atmospheres, more than 1,000 times the pressure you feel right now. It works out to more than a ton of force on every single square centimeter, as if you balanced the weight of several fighter jets on the tip of one finger and then held it there. That is not a place you visit casually. Send an ordinary submarine down and it would be crushed like a drink can long before it arrived. A sealed foam cup lowered on a line comes back the size of a thimble, squeezed permanently smaller by the pressure. Everything that goes down there, human or machine, has to be built to survive a force that our bodies simply cannot imagine. And yet, incredibly, a handful of people have gone. The story of reaching the bottom starts with a rope. Back in the 1870s, a British sailing ship called HMS Challenger crossed these waters on the first great scientific voyage to study the deep sea. In 1875, her crew lowered a weighted line and was stunned when it kept unspooling far past any depth anyone expected. That single sounding was humanity's first hint that something impossibly deep lay beneath them, and it is why the deepest point still carries the ship's name today. But nobody actually went down until 1960. Two men, Jacques Piccard and Don Walsh, climbed into a strange craft called a bathyscaphe, essentially a thick steel sphere hung beneath a giant float, and let it sink. For nearly 5 hours they fell through the darkness, listening to the hull groan, until they finally settled onto the floor of the Challenger Deep. They stayed only about 20 minutes, stirred up so much silt they could barely see, and then rose again. But they had done it. Two people had touched the deepest point on Earth, and for a long time they were the only ones. More than half a century passed before anyone returned. In 2012, the filmmaker James Cameron squeezed alone into a lime green vertical submersible he had helped design and dived to the bottom by himself, the first solo journey to the deepest place on the planet. Then, starting in 2019, an explorer named Victor Vescovo brought down a purpose-built submersible and did something new. He went back again and again, turning a once-in-a-generation feat into repeat expeditions, carrying scientists down to see the abyss with their own eyes. And here is a fact that captures just how alien this place is. For most of human history, more people had walked on the surface of the moon than had ever reached the bottom of the Challenger Deep. 12 astronauts left footprints in lunar dust, while barely a handful had ever seen the deepest ocean floor. Only in the last few years, with those repeated dives, has that balance finally tipped. We literally sent people to another world before we got serious about visiting the lowest point of our own. So if you did make it all the way down, if you asked how far down is the Mariana Trench and then actually went there, what would be waiting? Not nothing. That is the astonishing part. Even at the very bottom, in eternal darkness and unthinkable pressure, there is life. When the submersibles switch on their floodlights, the beams pick out pale creatures drifting and crawling across the mud. Animals that have never needed eyes for sunlight because there has never been any. The most abundant residents are amphipods, small shrimp-like crustaceans that swarm in the thousands, scavenging every scrap of food that sinks down from far above. Around them cling xenophyrophores, bizarre organisms that are technically single giant cells, some as wide as your hand, fragile blobs of living matter that somehow build delicate structures in the deepest mud on Earth. Sea cucumbers ooze across the sediment, filtering it for nutrients. It is a slow, silent, patient ecosystem running entirely on the crumbs of the world above. And you might wonder what any of them could possibly eat, so far from the sun that powers almost all life. The answer drifts down from far overhead. Scientists call it marine snow, a constant, gentle fall of tiny particles, the remains of plankton, scraps of dead animals, and waste from the sunlit world above, sinking slowly through kilometres of black water. Most of it is devoured long before it ever reaches the bottom, so only the faintest dusting of food actually settles in the trench. Every so often something far larger arrives, the carcass of a large fish or even a whale, and for the scavengers of the deep, it becomes a feast that can feed a crowd for months. The deepest ecosystem on Earth survives on leftovers, patiently waiting for the world above to drop it a meal. But there is a strange, invisible line down here that even biology cannot cross. Fish, it turns out, cannot make it to the very bottom. The deepest fish ever confirmed, a small, translucent, tadpole-like snailfish, lives thousands of meters above the trench floor, and studies suggest that at around 8 kilometres down there is a hard chemical limit past which the cells of a fish simply cannot function against the pressure. So the last few kilometres of the Challenger Deep belong to the invertebrates alone. There is a depth on this planet below which fish, one of the most successful groups of animals ever to exist, are physically forbidden to go, and the bottom of the Mariana Trench lies well beneath it. And that limit reveals something profound about how the deep works. At these depths, pressure does not simply crush bodies from the outside. It reaches inside and squeezes the very molecules of life, bending the proteins that every cell depends on until they can no longer hold their shape or do their job. So the animals that endure down here are packed with special protective molecules that behave like tiny internal scaffolding, propping their proteins open against the enormous force. It is this hidden chemistry, far more than any thick shell or armor, that lets a soft, fragile creature thrive where solid steel would buckle. And it is exactly this same defense that finally runs out for fish several kilometers above the floor, marking that invisible boundary below which their bodies can no longer keep themselves together. And then comes the discovery that should genuinely unsettle you. When explorers finally reached the deepest, most remote, most untouched place on the entire planet, expecting pristine wilderness, they found our garbage already there. A plastic bag, a sweet wrapper, waiting on the floor of the Challenger Deep, and it goes deeper than litter. When scientists tested those tiny scavenging amphipods, they discovered their bodies were laced with man-made industrial chemicals, pollutants banned decades ago, concentrated in creatures living at the bottom of the sea. The single most isolated spot on Earth, a place almost no human will ever see, is already stained by us. Step back and the whole picture becomes almost dizzying. We have detailed maps of the Moon, of Mars, of the far side of worlds hundreds of millions of kilometers away. And yet the majority of our own deep seafloor has never been mapped in real detail at all. The deepest point on Earth is right here, under our own ocean, and it remains one of the last genuinely unexplored frontiers we have. Every dive into the Mariana Trench still turns up creatures no one has ever named. So the next time someone asks how deep is the ocean, remember what that question really means. It means nearly 11 kilometers of crushing darkness. It means a trench that could swallow Everest and hide it under a mile of water. It means pressure that flattens steel, a wall of cold that never lifts, and a bottom so remote that fewer people have stood on it than have walked on the moon, and yet a plastic bag got there first. Here is what we want to know from you. Which part of this hits hardest? That Everest would completely disappear into the Challenger Deep? That there is life down there thriving in total darkness under 1,000 atmospheres? Or that we found our own trash at the deepest point on Earth before we ever finished exploring it? Tell us in the comments. And if this changed the way you picture the ocean beneath you, stay with us, because the deepest corners of our planet are still hiding things we have not even begun to understand.